Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. To wrap up today's trial, I'd like to go over the evidence that you heard, the points that you're going to need to make a decision on, and hopefully make your decision a little bit easier today, clarifying just what today's trial is all about. As you heard, the question today is, did the defendant, Officer Edward Waldman, show a reckless regard for my client, Mr. Robert Ramirez's life? Did he use excessive force when he shot Mr. Ramirez at point-blank range from 3 feet away? Of course, I'm going to tell you that yes, Officer Waldman did use excessive force. He was negligent. He used willful or even wanton disregard for my client's life when he shot him. Now, the judge will tell you today that my client, Mr. Ramirez, and I have the burden of proof. That is, we have the burden to prove to you today that we are right. We came in here today, we're the plaintiffs, and so we have the burden to prove to you today that Officer Waldman used excessive force. Now, the judge will tell you that the burden of proof is what's called a preponderance of the evidence. Or another phrase that he'll say is that it's more likely than not to have happened. It's more likely than not that Officer Waldman used excessive force. Now, what does it mean to use excessive force? What we will hopefully have proved to you today through the evidence is that Officer Waldman did not follow the guidelines that were set out through the Chicago Police Department manual, as you heard, and that he did not follow that the force that he used was not reasonable. This is another kind of a buzzword that the judge will tell you today as he gives you your final instructions. Your question today is, were Officer Waldman's actions reasonable? Did he act? Was it necessary for him to fire that bullet into Robert Ramirez's back? Now, I believe there are 3 reasons why Officer Waldman's actions were not reasonable, why he was negligent. The first reason is Robert Ramirez did not have a knife. Now, the defense today told you all about this knife that was found, and they even had both officers testified that my client, Mr. Ramirez, had a knife. However, you also heard from Mr. Ramirez himself that he doesn't even own a knife like that. You also heard other evidence why this just is not true. Mr. Ramirez did not have a knife that day. The second reason why Officer Waldman's actions were unreasonable was the distance that he was away from Mr. Ramirez when he fired that shot. Officer Waldman testified. Officer Levy, who was fighting with Mr. Ramirez that day, testified, and Mr. Ramirez also testified that the shot was fired. Officer Waldman fired the shot from 3 feet away. Officer Waldman testified that he was close enough to stop the fist fight with his hands. He was close enough to intervene without firing that shot, but instead he chose to fire that shot. This is why his actions were unreasonable. The third reason why Officer Waldman's actions were unreasonable and why it was unnecessary for him to use to act in that way is that he had a motivation to make up the story about the knife. Officer Waldman testified that as soon as he fired that shot, I asked him today, and he answered that as soon as he fired that shot, he knew he was going to have to come up with a reason of why he fired that shot. He knew he was going to have to justify using deadly force. And so, he and Officer Levy told the sergeant who showed up that day, and the other officers, they told the investigators, and they told you today, that Mr. Ramirez, who is left-handed, attacked Officer Levy with a knife in his right hand. They told you that Mr. Ramirez attacked you with a knife that was found later on laying on the ground, closed. What's interesting is that this knife is a locking blade. This knife that Officer Levy and Officer Waldman testified was the knife that my client used locks. They claim that this is the knife that he used, but the blade locks. It's interesting that when Mr. Ramirez was shot, he passed out. He didn't have time to open up the locking mechanism and close the knife before he fell to the ground. But when it was found later on by the sergeant who came to the scene and was picked up and bagged in evidence, it was closed, laying on the ground. What is also interesting is the knife had no fingerprints on it and had no blood on it. I find that very interesting because, as both officers testified and as Mr. Ramirez testified, as soon as he was shot, he fell to the ground and then he passed out. Mr. Ramirez did not have time to wipe this knife for fingerprints. He did not have time, before he passed out, to wipe the blood off of it that apparently should have been on there if the defendant's testimony were true. They testified that this knife struck Officer Levy and cut him in the shoulder. And yet this knife has no blood on it, has no fingerprints on it, and was laying on the ground, locked. Mr. Ramirez, after getting shot, had to go through several months in the hospital of treatment before he was released. Even today, he still has pain in his shoulder from the gunshot. He still has a few fragments from that bullet remaining in his shoulder today. He had to forego 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months of work because of the injury. And even today, he cannot do his normal jobs as a carpenter. All because of the negligence of Officer Waldman for shooting him in the back rather than physically breaking up the fight. Thank you.